Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Dr. Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Hello, everyone. Watagwan, Pamwatagwan, and welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, where we explore the stories, histories, and cultural legacies that shape the Caribbean and its global diaspora. One of the most powerful things about some of the works and things that we create is film and its ability to hold memory. Through moving images, sound, archives, landscapes, and storytelling, filmmakers can preserve histories that might otherwise be forgotten, challenge the narratives we inherit, and create new ways of seeing ourselves and our communities. And for the Caribbean, where so much of our history has been shaped by colonialism, migration, displacement, and fragmented archives, filmmaking becomes ever more significant. It becomes a way of reclaiming voice, a way of documenting lives and experiences that have too often existed at the margins, a way of connecting people across islands, languages, and diasporas. Today's episode explores the intersections of Caribbean filmmaking, memory, history, and Black storytelling, spotlighting how filmmakers navigate the tensions between archive and imagination, and how film collectives like the Caribbean Tales Media Group's Cross-Continental Forum have helped shape Black diasporic cultural production. Because Caribbean storytelling has never only been about entertainment, it has also been about preservation, resistance, survival, and imagining futures otherwise. Joining us today to talk about her experiences and the work of the Cross-Continental Forum is director, producer, and creative industries strategist Meschida Phillip, whose work brings film production and screen industry development in the Caribbean together. And so, Meschida, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Do let our listeners know a little bit more about you, where, of course, in the region you call home, and what inspired your passions as a filmmaker and storyteller, and ultimately, what specifically about film spoke to you as a medium.
Hi, thank you so much for this opportunity, and it's wonderful being here today. And as you warmly introduced me, my name is Meschida Phillip. I am Grenadian born, and I share space currently between Grenada and the US. I've been doing that now for some years. My focus is documentary filmmaking, as well as I'm now dabbling into new media, which is really, really exciting. And I am also the founder and executive director of the 12 Degrees North, 61 Degrees West Grenada Film Festival. I've been doing that now for 8 seasons. And yeah, it's a good time. As far as film is concerned, coming from a small island like Grenada, where the culture is so rich, and a big part of my history and my lived experiences come from a space of migration. So that was the impetus for me getting into the film business as a director producer, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. I've been dabbling in the creative space for years. My trajectory spans from music production all the way now to actual film as the medium that I'm outputting. So yeah, a little bit about me.
It's wonderful to have you. I was actually going to start with that question about, how did growing up in Grenada really shape the kinds of stories you feel compelled to tell now as a filmmaker?
As I mentioned, Grenada is a small island with a very large history. And one of the most impactful memory for me was during the Grenada Revolution. I was a kid then. And that is a staple in my timeline because not too long after that, about 2 years after that, my mom migrated to the US. And that was a very defining moment for me. I was under 10. I'm not going to say my age. I was under 10 years old at the time. And the last of three children by my mom. And she was my anchor and unaware of how long she would have been gone for, that became a thing. So basically, I was separated from my mom for about 7, 8 years until we were reunited again. So that bond was broken during that time. But she has always been present in our lives. But we did not have that intimacy of the relationship. So yeah, that kind of subconsciously put things in place. And it's not until I was an adult, I started to really explore personal issues and how I was actually handling certain encounters in my life. And I started to think about who I am, why I was responding to things the way I responded to things, why I had such difficulties in connecting with people, trusting people, and the whole nine yards. And I actually sought out therapy to find answers. And when I had the opportunity to go into grad school, that was my thesis. I wanted to figure out if there was anyone else that shared similar experiences like I did. So yeah, this was just a thesis process in me trying to figure out answers to the question, and that just led into something completely different.
Thank you for sharing that. We oftentimes talk about this concept that what Dr. Claudette Crawford Brown calls barrel children, right? And having had the opportunity to watch your first feature film, which is entitled Scars of Our Mother's Dreams, which I will, of course, link for our listeners to also check out, it raises, as you were saying through your thesis work, that it wasn't just an independent, situation. It wasn't just you, right? It wasn't just the children of Grenada. It's a Caribbean wide, but of course, worldwide when we get into the politics of migration and necessity and all of those things. But your film was previously a part of the Cross-Continental Forum, and I think really deals with some of these lived realities and the aftermath of, Barrel Children's experiences, or what Dr. Crawford Brown calls Barrel Children's experiences. And so for you, what emotional or, historical questions really inspired the film? I'll let you answer first before I can give some of my takes, but, additionally, why was it really important for you to explore these themes, especially of, like, emotional trauma, childhood abandonment, things like that?
As I mentioned, the film began basically with my own quest to seek answers. It was my lived experience growing up with not just one absent parent, but both my parents migrated. My dad migrated years before, and my mom, who was the staple, the foundation in my experiences, she then left. So for years, I carried that wound without fully understanding it or having the language for it. Growing up in the Caribbean, you're basically told what to do. Like you don't question, you don't question what adults say. The elephant in the room, you really don't really express certain things. And I think having the experience of the consistency of my mom in my life, meaning back then it was mail, you used to write mail, right? And letters. So just imagine I would be experiencing something. I write my mom. It would take maybe like 2 weeks for her to receive it. And then another 2 weeks for her to respond, for me to get her response. So you're talking about a month thereabout, give or take, right? So by the time I get a response and she's trying to nurture us and soothe us, that issue's already gone, right? The urgency in dealing with the situation at hand was not something that was tangible. So we had to seek other ways in which, meaning my sister and my brother, we had to seek other ways in which we were comforting each other and raising each other in that sense. So my eldest sister was responsible for us, right? Because she understood things a little bit different. So which is quite interesting because her experiences as the first is completely different from my experience as the last and then my brother in the middle. So when I started this journey, girl, it was not pretty. Because now I am asking questions. And it's like, why you want to discuss dirty laundry or why you want to bring this up right now? And, you know, what is the problem? And my family was not really comprehending, in my opinion, what I was trying to seek answers for because now we categorize it as different things. It can be either selfishness, it can be either you're difficult. There are so many different descriptors, right, for the way in which someone would respond to things without having answers because we never discuss these things. So I recalled having my mom and my oldest sister who sat them down and we're having conversation. It wasn't pretty. It was really, really intense, right? But we had to discuss it. And only then, as an adult, I came to find out that my mom did not just leave. She left for vacation, found an opportunity, stayed, and that led to her working and making certain sacrifices in order to give us a better lifestyle, right? But as a child, you don't know this. And these are conversations that is not discussed within families. So by the time we were reconnected, like I mentioned, the distance and that emotional bond that should be so easy between a mom and a child was no longer there. So now you have a whole slew of different emotions now to figure out. Am I rebelling? Am I doing this? Am I doing that? So it's like you're now deemed a certain way, right? So these were moments of hard truth. And I think at the end, it became better. And while going through this research, to prepare myself for my thesis film, that's when I discovered the barrel child syndrome. I did not know this was actually a terminology. And I discovered Dr. Crawford. I think I actually went down to Maryland, if I'm not mistaken, to meet with her to have further conversations about it. So I really went deep into it. I spoke to different psychologists and therapists to understand better because as a documentary filmmaker, I think you have a responsibility to do adequate research because now you are actually informing people of certain things, right? And I wanted this to answer questions. I did not want my voice in the film initially. I did not want it to be like, oh my gosh, here she goes, right? Self-serving. So hence the reason why I actually sought out different people who had similar experiences to give this layer. And I recall when we were editing the film, I said it just felt empty because something was missing and it was my personal experiences that opened up the film, but allow other individuals to answer the questions that was posed. Is this a problem?
I realize we've been using the term and not all of our listeners might be familiar. And so before continuing on the conversation, I just want to give a brief nod to that. So for anybody who's not aware, Dr. Crawford's term barrel children really refers to the phenomenon in which, children are left back home in the Caribbean or, certainly other places as well. But from a Caribbean context, they're left at home in the Caribbean, often under the care of grandmothers and aunties and, other family members while their parents go abroad, usually to the, global north, US, UK. Canada, etc., really in search for better opportunities. And as Mashida was sort of pointing at, right, there's obviously the disconnect between the emotional care and connection that espouses because of the distance, but you may have oftentimes the more financial resources, right? That's also where the term barrel comes in because you may be able to get the shoes and the, marina and whatever it is for school that your parents are sending home to you. But that emotional distance is certainly there. But as you were talking, that was certainly something that I thought of being able to watch the film, right? And see how I think I was really captivated that you started with your story, right? And also then parallel off to other people's experiences. And I think for me, it was one of the things that I really greatly took away and appreciated, especially at the end of the film, was hearing how people are parenting themselves, right? Because you're now speaking to these people as adults who are reflecting back on their experiences, the hurt that they experienced, but also how that has then not only translated into how they aim to be parents, but also the work that they are doing within the community to better support others who have gone through sort of similar instances. And so for me, it really led to this question of like, what power do you think film holds in being able to impact this memory? Just because ultimately, we can write about things, right? This could have been a research paper, for instance, or something, right? Much like Dr. Crawford's work, but it is a special thing, and I don't know if I have the word for it, but it's a special thing to see it captured in film this way. And so, sort of, how do you hope that being able to capture this through film impacts memory and social change? And ultimately, what conversations were you hoping that the film would inspire?
Initially, I did not know what kind of conversation the film was going to inspire. I honestly had no clue. I just knew I wanted to tell the story, and I'm like, okay, so the story is told. But I did not realize how deep this resonate globally. And as you said earlier, although the film featured Grenadians, this is a universal issue. Migration and immigration, the migrant tale is something that all cultures experience, right? And people have different reasons for migrating. But it comes down to the fundamental part in most times wanting to do better for their children. And out of everyone that I spoke to at the time and continue to speak to after this film was premiered, that is the same sort of conclusion that was drawn. We migrated, we left because we wanted to do better. But as life have it sometimes, you have people who start new families. There are those who migrate and never look back. So there is childhood abandonment that takes place because they start a whole new life and forget about where they came from. Then you have situations like myself where there is years of disconnection, and sometimes it's very hard for you to ever regain that emotional connection with your parent. So there is always a disconnect. Then you have the viewpoint of the parent and their experiences as well that this film did not really address to because we only took one aspect of it, right? The sacrifices of the parents as well, leaving your family and having, depending on what job you took out here, like in my mom's case, she was a domestic worker. So basically her responsibilities were raising other people's children, whereas your kids are left and being raised by someone else. So you have that um, emotional and mental and psychological issues that she also and parents like her had to deal with, right? Then you have the issues of the caregiver who now take up the responsibility and become that staple for that child. And when reunification comes around, that child now is leaving the safety of the caretaker and whatever relationship that they probably had with that caretaker. Now, so it's just a lot. It's very complex, right? And very dynamic. So what I recognize that this film served as was a conversation starter. And it was a small window into people looking in observationally to say, it's not just me. And how can I do better? You see? Because our society and our culture is not one where therapy was introduced at a very young, formative period. So there is the silence and the unspoken elephant in the room syndrome that is taking place. And you just have to know how to fix it. So when we were finished with the production of this film, you're hearing from the subjects, the majority of the subjects who were part of this. Thank you. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to verbalize how I felt all these years and to get it out. And it's an opportunity for them themselves to make different decisions in how they are choosing to parent their own children. You see, several of them had the opportunity to leave and they made the decision to stay because they did not want their children to go through the same kind of trauma that they themselves went through. Because it's not in all the situations, but sometimes you will see from Dr. Crawford Brown's study, there are abuse that takes place, physical, sexually abuse that takes place with kids left behind, broken homes. I called it the waiting syndrome because that's how I that's how I had described my period and for myself, right? The waiting syndrome. Because I waited for so long. And I realized that that also transcended in my adult life. Because whenever I was dealing with situations, nothing was urgent for me. I always waited. I was waiting to see what will happen. I am waiting to see this. So I had to like really make sense. So coming out of this film also gave me some personal insights in how to heal myself as well and become a stronger version of myself. You're right. There is something about seeing something on screen, hearing people's voice, seeing the emotions, right? Versus that of just reading it. Because now it becomes real through the visual means. So this was an opportunity in this film where the conversations that I was having with these people provided an opportunity for healing. To me, that's the takeaway with this from the historical context and how it shaped memories and social changes.
Thank you. I think that brought together a lot of my thoughts just, having watched it and being able to, especially at the end, as I was mentioning, see people hug their own kids, right? Having told this story about their own experiences as children and then see them hug their own kids, and grandchildren, right? See how this experience has shaped them as a person, but also the adult that they chose to become and how they chose to parent, to nurture, right? To sort of end cycles. And I very much so agree that, there's a power in being able to visualize that, um, that, I think wouldn't be captured in such a heart-wrenching way, right, on paper or, for instance, in a different medium. You were talking about other people's responses to the film, right? And, that this is very much so a global issue. And that, of course, brings me to the Cross-Continental Forum because your film was premiered there a while back. And so for those who are unfamiliar, the Caribbean Tales Media Group has a what one of their staple programs called the Cross-Continental Forum. It's actually running now through September and specializes on bringing Black producers across, Africa, the Caribbean, Canada, the UK, and Latin America to really foster sustainable industry growth within filmmaking. And wanted to ask you, personally, given your experiences having participated, what was your time in the program like, and how do you think it helped shape you as a filmmaker and strengthen your relationship with Black creatives across the world?
Um, Participating in CCF, the inaugural one in Barbados 2 years ago, it was a very transformational experience because it placed me in a room where producers and filmmakers from across the Caribbean and Africa and the wider diaspora were in the same safe space, and we had an opportunity to be honest about the fact that all of us were grappling with similar or the same fundamental questions about whose story get told and who gets to tell them. There's a responsibility, right? A fundamental responsibility in that. And I honestly believe after having the opportunity to premiere Scars, one at Caribbean Tales, and also traveling with this film to other international spaces that had very diverse audiences. If someone else told that story, I'm not sure if it would have had the same kind of impact. But the mere fact that we, or in this particular situation, I had the opportunity to go in and listen and tell the story, not just from their experiences, but also from my own personal experiences, gave this film depth and and increased the production value for this film. That it is not just a film, but it's also an archival piece, right? That can be studied and dissected and transformed and also expanded on, right? Because in as much as we are living in a very digitalized space where things, there is a sense of connection. The ease of connection is still better. The trauma of migration still exists underneath, right? Because now I'm not sure which one is worse, honestly. If waiting 4 weeks to get a response and not knowing what your mom is doing versus the urgency of seeing that your mom is living a good life or your dad is living a good life in the foreign space, right? And you are separated from them, right? And you don't have that. And in the event that they went on and have additional children outside of the kids left behind, there is that sense of competition and belonging that is there. So the issue is still something that is quite relevant because people are still migrating. You see what I'm saying? So having the opportunity to showcase this project for the audiences that this was intentionally made for, that also gave me the language and the strategy that I wanted to focus on doing more work from a social context that had deeper meaning and understanding. So a lot of things that I do, I really focus on the psychological and social impact of our people. And I try to put it forth where you're left with questions or answers to the questions that was raised in the piece. You see what I'm saying? As an opportunity to start a conversation and a discussion around it. So, yeah, both CCF in Barbados and the festivals provided me with a path forward to tell more Caribbean stories and understand how important Caribbean cinema is in this whole ecosystem because representation is huge and lack of representation for so many years have been existing. So myself and other Caribbean filmmakers who are taking up this helm of telling our stories, our experiences through our lens, that is something that I feel is really needed. And I think that is what gives me that driving force every day to get up and just continue to do more. Despite the challenges, is something that we know that we just have to do.
Given that, I want to ask my next question really just sort of within the framing of your expertise as a filmmaker, because having participated in a program like CCF, although based in Barbados, when you participated, as we already said, it brought together Black filmmakers from across the world, right? It's really a diasporic program, which I find, you know, amazing and very, very necessary for the work that all of us are doing when we were talking about, building Black histories, Black stories, Black creative work. And I think just from a historical perspective, there are, of course, a lot of similarities that can be drawn between, for instance, the Caribbean and countries in Africa. And so for creatives such as yourself who are coming together, we don't really see as much of that collaboration. And, you can speak to it particularly from like a filmmaking perspective, but, I think that that also applies more generally beyond filmmaking as well, right? So what do you think really are the barriers that exist, that limit the extent to which deeper collaborations between the regions are like, impeding and impacting the ways that we work together?
Well, we start with the basics, right? As far as barriers is concerned, when coming to filmmaking, the basics, you start there, the funding infrastructure, right? So if you're based in the Caribbean, there are certain financial barriers that we are not privy to in the sense of the accessibility and ease of being qualified for certain funding resources and also just basic banking transactions in the Caribbean becomes very problematic, right? And when I started a few years ago, because I'm still pretty young in that industry, but when I started a few years ago from Grenada, the industry was not as advanced as it is right now. There wasn't that much support in forging financial funding for creatives who wanted to pursue things like filmmaking, and other creative ventures. So most Caribbean countries or most small island countries like ours face that funding infrastructure challenges and also finding ways in which you can now reach out to someone, say like in Africa, to co-produce a film with. Like, how do you do that? You know, because the resources were not in place. So fast forward several years later, we have a new government that prioritize the creative sector in Grenada, and film is one of those sectors in which attention is being placed. So there are certain incentives that make it much easier. There are certain memorandum that was signed by the government with certain African countries. So there is now relationships that are being implemented to make things a little bit easier for not just funding resources, but also human resources, cross-cultural exchanges, right? And accessing those territories as well. Another barrier that we find is the distribution network, right? So historically, you would find a lot of Caribbean filmmakers going through the film festival route, especially for Caribbean film festivals. So back then you had Caribbean Tales, you had Good Horizon, you had Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, then you had Jamaica had a film festival, Barbados had a, so in order for us to get some level of visibility for the work that we were putting on, you will see that a lot of us were going through those spaces of utilizing film festival. However, there is still a disconnect as well, right? Because most people did not even understand that that opportunity was also available, right? Because, in the Caribbean, you just basically learn. You learn on your own. You want to do something, you learn on your own, right? So that was another barrier, especially if you did not have individuals in the diaspora that could have supported you and show you the way as well. Lack of formal co-production treaties that was existing amongst different Caribbean countries as well as international spaces. So again, making it a little bit more difficult for us to have these opportunities for our producers to go out there and get the work. And even if you went on your own, quite often, and you would reach out to these international infrastructures and spaces, you also risk the possibility of maybe, let me try to frame it very diplomatically, being cheated, right? Because sometimes you just don't know. Because we still have this full level of hope, right? We believe, we are excited. We're very passionate people from the Caribbean, right? You just want your story to be told. But if you don't have the expertise, you rely on others who sometimes just take advantage of you. And you saw that happening a lot, right? And then the visibility gap, because the Caribbean is also lumped into Latin America. So we are not necessarily, that's through the distribution chain, as well as giving us our own identity, right? And just the geographical location of how it is in the Caribbean, traveling from one country to the next also was very expensive. So having this kind of collaboration amongst different islands also poses its own challenges when everyone wanted to have the best production industry, right? Because every island has their own mandates and every island has their own intentions, right? So you had all of these different barriers when I just started and still exist in some way, shape, or form still, right? But I must say the internet and also the film festivals, the Caribbean film festivals, and also certain online infrastructures like Anansi TV are providing opportunities for Caribbean people to be seen. And there are, the internet provides us an opportunity to do further research and be able to now get more visibility for the work that we're doing. So, in spite of the fact that there were barriers, we are also seeing all of the opportunities that is coming on board, right? In the last 3, 4, 5 years, which I think the Caribbean right now is really buzzing. And having this bridge between the Caribbean and Africa, as well as the North American diaspora and Europe, but most of that synergy that is currently the intentionality, I should say, that the governments of the Caribbean now is advocating for in reaching out and closing gaps between the Caribbean and Africa to provide us with more opportunities. That to me is revolutionary. And it's also very inspiring for emerging filmmakers and seasoned filmmakers right now to be able to reach wider audiences.
Certainly, and I think that gets to, for me, one of the points of, why we're even having this discussion. CCF recently announced their first co-development grant, or the winners rather of their first co-development grant. So to your point about, different organizations and film festivals really supporting creatives, these are, really important for filmmakers and other creatives looking for avenues to really distribute their work, gain more international recognition and, boost collaboration. I additionally want to ask sort of in your view, because, we're talking about collaboration and Black storytelling, what does it look like ideally for you, if you were to envision a future of really mass, not mass, but, an ideal avenue and an ideal pathway by which Black creatives were really collaborating with each other across different islands, across different nations? What would it look like and feel like for you?
Wow. What that future would look like for me. Well, it's actually present right now, it's current right now. Because CCF is actually in motion, right? And making it happen, right? But ideally, that future looks like for me where a filmmaker from Grenada and a filmmaker from either Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana can access a shared co-production fund specifically designed for the Global South Partnership, with no requirements that you have to go through the Western or the traditional institutional ways to qualify for. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is what we alluded to earlier was direct distribution pipelines. Having the opportunity to be in Africa 2 years ago and seeing the vastness of audiences, right? And there is a quest to learn that cultural exchange, right, between the Caribbean and Africa, right? So that direct distribution pipeline between Africa and the Caribbean markets, I think that is huge for us to expand streaming and broadcast deals between the regions. Um, what that future looks like. I would say a well resourced physical and virtual infrastructure where allows us to meet annually and keep filmmakers in active relationships year round, not just once a year. And, President and CCF and the entire team there, they already started that. And there are other individuals who are following suit and has partnered up with them to make this a reality, right? Learning, learning exchanges. That's another thing, right? And just having that opportunity for someone from the Caribbean to get that opportunity to maybe go study film in, say, Nigeria or Ghana, right? And learn from them how they're doing it because they are just producing things, right? And the quality of the films is top notch, right? So just having that opportunity for that educational exchange, right? That to me is important. And where we can see more fusion of Caribbean slash African storytelling because we have shared experiences. It's only a matter of time that we see more or we're discovering more fusion in the storytelling. I think those add so much depth. That's one of my projects that I had actually proposed for this year to CCF because I wanted to do a project that is very inclusive of the dynamics between the Caribbean and Africa. So I'm excited to see what that would look like. And this is what that future looks like. An opportunity to go to a market, a film market, where resources would be available to us to say, yes, we believe in this story. We understand why this needs to be made with us having to justify why we think it's important. Because fundamentally and through lived experiences, they know the reason why it needs to be made. So, you asked me that's a very important question. I think that the final note on that I would say is, and I want to frame it right. The future I see is a world where the economic model for Black storytelling does not require us as Black filmmakers or Caribbean filmmakers to dilute our cultural specificity to access the market, where the richness of our particular story is the selling point. I think that to me would be the future that I envision.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I couldn't have you on here without asking you about some of your favorite films, just because I'm always interested. And so, while of course the focus of our conversation today has been around cross-cultural storytelling, so they can be cross-cultural if you'd like, but they don't have to be. But I'd love to for you to share with our listeners some of your favorite examples of, Caribbean films and the way that they shape and, really reflect who we are and our histories and experiences.
That is just an unfair question for someone who programs
I know.
so much films, right? Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness. Where do I start? So, a staple for me is The Harder They Come, right? Um,
Naturally.
seriously, right? 'Cause that's one of the first films as a kid I recall seeing that was Caribbean, was Caribbean people on screen, right? And it was just so raw, right? And just so cultured, right? Um, so for me, The Harder They Come was one of that. And then through my process, when I was actually producing the Scars of a Mother's Dream, there was a film called I think a Barrel Stories Project. But that was done by Lisa Haywood. She's from Barbados. And to me, that just spoke and it expanded on what it was that I was doing. And there is another film, it's not Caribbean, but it spoke to the sense of familiar cultural exchanges, right, and experiences. There was a film called The Nanny, and in it, basically, Nancy was the protagonist in that film, right? And the domestic worker was African, and just the same concept of the same barrel child syndrome aspect, right, was layered with that of the Anansi story that was brought into it. So that folklore aspect came into that space. I thought that was a really, really nice film. And then Marshall Montano film, Bazodi. So Bazodi to me was a film that I think is worth studying, right? Because it dealt with that whole intersectionality between the African, Caribbean, and then the Indian, right? When we were in Ivory Coast 2 years ago, and we were talking about Caribbean films that picked up distribution, I believe that was one of the films that picked up distribution in Africa, right? And it was well received. And I was like, wow. So you see, there is a desire for our films to be seen, right? Quality films to be seen. And I think because of limited resources, most times we limit ourselves to making short films because that's what we can financially manage. But the opportunity to make feature length films, and that's another thing. Ideally, the future would be having more feature length, high valued, production valued film that is representing us, coming up with our voices, made by our people, coming out from the Caribbean. That there is no way we cannot get the visibility that we know is possible for stories coming out of the Caribbean.
I know I asked a hard question, but you also just answered my final question, which was which was in a way sort of, how how can these co-productions, either within the region or, interregionally, really help shape global perceptions about Black storytelling and storytellers? And I think you've really covered that for us, right? By being able to share that it's not, on one hand, of course, as you were saying earlier, it's about the pooling of resources, about, better distribution, etc. But really, I think what I took away from what you said a moment ago was the fact that who we are and what makes us special, um, when it comes to the work that filmmakers and other creatives are doing should be at the heart of our work, and instead not not needing to diminish it for the sake of getting production and, you know, other details like that. And so I ultimately really want to thank you, Mashida, for joining us for this episode. I think this is one that I learned a lot from. I will, of course, include for our listeners links to the films that you mentioned, and of course, links to Scars of Our Mother's Dreams. I really enjoyed watching it. And I think, several of our listeners will as well. And so, with that, thank you so much for, again, being a guest on the show, sharing more about not only your work, but also the work of Caribbean Tales Media Group. For our listeners tuning in, for seasoned filmmakers, for budding filmmakers, I cannot recommend enough checking out Caribbean Tales CCF programming. It is one that I think brings, again, together storytellers from the region, from across the Black diaspora to do amazing work, right? To continue pivoting, um, sharing, learning from one another, and really building up the work of Black storytelling and filmmaking for us to learn and work together from one another. And so, with that, thank you so much all for tuning in. Links, as always, will be on our website, in our show notes, etc. Until next time, look more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspod.com for more information on each episode, and you can find all of our social media platforms there to stay connected.